Hello, Dr. Grande here. Today I'll be looking at the closing arguments and the verdict in the trial of Sarah Boone. This case has been going on for a long time. It's a bizarre case. It had an expected outcome, in my opinion, but it was still an adventure to get there. One of the most unusual cases I've seen in a while. I'll go through a brief background of the case, offer a summary of the closing arguments, then offer my analysis. Sarah Boone lived with her boyfriend George Torres in Winter Park, Florida, near Orlando. On February 24, 2020, she called 911 and indicated that her boyfriend was dead. The police soon discovered that George had been zipped in a suitcase and died from positional asphyxiation. Sarah's story was that she had been playing a game of hide-and-seek with George. She zipped him into the suitcase, believing he could unzip himself and escape. She went to bed, and the next morning, she found George dead. The police found 2 cell phone videos that Sarah had recorded of the suitcase when George was in it. Sarah was taunting him during these videos. Sarah was charged with second-degree murder. In a very unwise decision, she turned down a plea bargain for manslaughter and decided to take her chances at trial. This trial started on October 14, 2024. By this time, Sarah changed her story and was now arguing she killed George in self-defense. In my previous video, I covered Sarah's testimony. Essentially, her argument was that George mistreated her in terrible ways for years, which made her fearful and caused her to develop battered spouse syndrome. Technically, of course, Sarah was not a spouse. She wasn't married to George, but the syndrome is not dependent on marital status. On the night of the killing, Sarah and George were just being playful when she zipped him into the suitcase, but then George became mean. Sarah decided to leave George in the suitcase because she was afraid he would kill her. Under cross-examination, the state pointed out a few problems with Sarah's behavior, including the fact that she did nothing to help George. Toward the end of the trial, as part of the state's rebuttal, several videos were introduced which did not look too good for Sarah. Body camera was played in court from when the police were called out to alleged domestic violence incidents involving Sarah and George. These videos made both of them look ridiculous, immature, and irresponsible. After this, the police played cell phone video that Sarah had recorded. Apparently, this was something that she really liked to do. She had captured these strange interrogations of George, where she berated him, complained about his drinking, and said she did not love him. She appeared to be trying to get George to confess to wrongdoing, specifically wrongdoing toward her. Like she wanted to capture this confession on video. She wanted to have something to use against him. It's also possible this was her only method of confronting George, because he would be violent otherwise. In one of the cell phone interrogation videos, George did appear to attack Sarah, like he came toward her, and it looked like he made contact with her. The state also presented a series of text messages featuring a number of expletives. Now moving to a summary of the closing arguments, which were presented on the afternoon of October 25, 2024. First, the state presented their closing argument, followed by the defense closing argument, and then the state offered a rebuttal. The state made a few assertions during their closing argument. For example, the first video recorded by Sarah taunting George as he was trapped in the suitcase demonstrated Sarah's depravity. This is important because of the wording of the law as far as second-degree murder. Voluntary intoxication was not a defense, so Sarah can't say, I was intoxicated, therefore I'm not responsible. George was a bad guy, but Sarah was not entitled to use force because she was not in danger at the time of the killing. So George's prior bad acts did not matter. Sarah and/or George may have had battered spouse syndrome, but the syndrome was not the cause of the killing. George died a horrible and slow death. Sarah used a bat to hit his hand and laughed as he died. She made inconsistent statements to the police, and she controlled and manipulated George. Now moving to the assertions made by the defense during their closing argument, Sarah was traumatized by George and was a victim. George was a monster who caused Sarah to develop battered spouse syndrome and post-traumatic stress disorder. Time heals, but Sarah was never given a break. She was never given a chance to heal. This was a case of learned helplessness. George had made Sarah into a person who was desperate. Sarah was trapped by her mental health symptoms, including fear. The trauma response changed the way that she thought about the world, including how she perceived danger. So circumstances that didn't look dangerous to someone else may look dangerous to Sarah. Sarah was not perfect and made misguided attempts to manage her situation, but there was no murder. She may have verbally mistreated George, but she was not charged with any offense related to that. This wasn't a trial about verbal mistreatment. This was a murder trial. When Sarah trapped George in the suitcase, she had a moment of power, which she used to vocalize her feelings. This was rare for Sarah. She did not have the opportunity often to express herself to George. He became mean, which represented an imminent threat, again in the way Sarah viewed the world. Sarah was hypervigilant to any change in tone due to the prior mistreatment. Leaving George to die was the act of a battered spouse. Sarah was afraid in that moment. The suitcase may have been an unconventional tool, but it was used to block an attack. Some of Sarah's other bad behavior, like being deceptive, was caused by battered spouse syndrome. So really, everything bad that Sarah did could be explained by George, not just the killing. In the end, the defense argued that Sarah had enough. She fought back, and she survived. During the rebuttal, the state made some of the same arguments they made earlier. They really tried to drive home the idea that this was not a case of self-defense. For example, they said that Sarah was angry. She put George in danger by zipping him in the suitcase. George was fighting for his life, which included him saying, "I will end you." He had the right to threaten Sarah under those circumstances. Again, he was just trying to survive. Sarah's past grievances did not give her the right to kill. The law required Sarah to act. Sarah did not exhaust every reasonable means to escape the danger that she created. For instance, she could have called 911. After closing arguments, it didn't take long for the jury to return a verdict. Sarah was found guilty of second-degree murder. She is scheduled to be sentenced on December 2, 2024. Sarah is facing up to life in prison. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. Overall, I think the state did a better job than the defense during closing arguments. There was room for improvement. For example, the state was repetitive. However, they made a few clear points. Sarah caused the danger and had an obligation to act. She did not possess the right to kill George in that moment. Voluntary intoxication is no excuse, and battered spouse syndrome did not explain her behavior. I don't think the defense did a terrible job, but Sarah's attorney did seem a bit disorganized. For example, he was kind of scattered. His presentation was fragmented. He did not really string together points to make a cohesive argument. And he had a lot of trouble finding what he needed in his notes. No paper was safe from being shuffled while he was addressing the jury. The real problem for the defense, however, was beyond the quality of the presentation. It was about the nature of the evidence. Other than Sarah, I don't think anyone was surprised by the verdict. Which brings me to item number 2. After the verdict, Sarah's attorney said that Sarah was shocked by being found guilty of second-degree murder. When asked about Sarah's refusal to accept a plea bargain, he talked about how Sarah really wanted her day in court. She was not open to any plea bargain, and she was even willing to go to court without an attorney. Item number 3. Other than sentencing, this dramatic and bizarre case has reached its conclusion. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. The relationship between Sarah and George involved impulsivity, irresponsibility, immaturity, manipulation, violence, and a lot of alcohol. The word dysfunctional does not begin to capture how toxic the relationship was. They lived in an intoxicated blur, featuring unnecessary suffering, chronic misery, and reckless outbursts. Each of them hurt the other badly and repeatedly. As far as the development of battered spouse syndrome or anything like that, maybe both of them had something like this to one degree or another. Either way, it did not drive their bad behavior. That job was already taken by alcohol. Sarah could have escaped the relationship many times, but she chose to remain in it. It sounds like she was afraid of losing George, as if he was some type of great catch. Somehow, Sarah fell into a cycle of being harmed, and then explaining to George how bad he was for harming her. Clearly, George was never going to change, but Sarah kept acting like he would. It's like she believed in magic. There's a sense that Sarah gained something from playing the role of a parent. She treated George like a child. This was evident during her testimony in court. Even though they both drank to excess, Sarah was judgmental and heavily criticized George frequently. She needed to believe that he was somehow worse than her. He was the one causing all her pain. Everything that was wrong in her life, George was to blame. On the night of the Suitcase murder, many of the bad characteristics possessed by the couple conspired to cause the disaster. Somehow George ended up in the suitcase. How this really happened may never be known. He may have climbed in there himself, but Sarah zipped it and trapped him. At this point, she saw an opportunity to hurt George and could not pass it up. Her sadism and her judgmental attitude took over. From Sarah's perspective, this was her chance to make George pay for all the times he harmed her. Furthermore, she really did believe, at some level, that George's problem was he did not listen to her. If he would only pay attention to what she was saying, all their problems would go away. With George as a captive audience, Sarah taunted him and tried to teach him a lesson. Sarah was so intoxicated, she may not have realized the consequences of her behavior, and clearly her memory was affected. She did not even remember recording her murdering George. When it was time to face the music, Sarah was not interested in accepting any responsibility. She did not want to admit to any crime at all. She had a way to escape with a relatively minor penalty by taking the plea bargain, but Sarah wanted more. George may have been Sarah's adversary, but Sarah was her own worst enemy. She was determined to continue the strategy which she had been using all along. Again, all Sarah's problems were caused by George not listening to her. Now she had a chance to make the jury listen to her message. Figuratively, they were trapped just like George was. They had to sit there, as Sarah explained to them, how terrible her life was. If they could only understand how much she suffered at the hands of George, if they would only listen to her like George should have listened to her, if they would sit still and hear her argument, she would never be convicted. Essentially, Sarah was saying, look how bad it was for me. I was always the victim in this relationship, so think of me as a victim now. Being a victim gave me the power and the authority to use deadly force. She was also saying, look what George made me do. His last bad act resulted in his own death. This was his doing. It proves how terrible he was. There was no way Sarah was going to pass up the largest audience she ever had for her message about George's shortcomings. This was her big chance to point out to the world how she was right the entire time. Sarah wanted and expected a massive victory in court. Killing George wasn't enough. She wanted to walk away from his death a hero, 100% vindicated. She thought that as she walked out of court, people would say, oh, George had it coming. This was nothing even close to a murder. Really, Sarah should be elected president or something because she's such a great individual. It does not surprise me that Sarah was shocked by her conviction. In addition to a long prison sentence, Sarah has to face something much more frightening. Her feelings were invalidated. The jury shattered her entire belief system. Her understanding of the world has been exposed as incorrect. My guess is that Sarah will come to view this jury as yet another entity who mistreated her. So they're just getting in line. There's this line that is formed of people who just don't understand how great Sarah is, and they don't understand how much she was victimized. Now moving to my final thoughts. When looking at the relationship between Sarah and George, one is left with the impression that they were both destined for destruction. They were trapped in a strange cycle that could only end one way, badly. Sarah killed George, but her work was not done. This was only half the job. Without the insight to realize it, Sarah acted to complete the cycle of destruction and walked herself directly into a long prison sentence, longer than she needed to serve. George may have died at Sarah's hands, but the dynamic he shared with her lived on through Sarah and gained his revenge. Those are my thoughts on this extremely bizarre case. It has ended in a way that I think everybody expected, except for Sarah, and it's left a few questions out there, right? There's still, I think, a little bit of a mystery as to exactly what happened. The trial did clear up a lot, however. It really gave people, I think, a better view of what Sarah was really like her true nature. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't self-defense. It truly was second-degree murder. She was convicted of exactly what she did. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.